On behalf of the GSDEC team, I'd like to welcome everybody and thank everybody for making time out to attend our conference today. So for the next few minutes, I just want to share a little bit about the network and also about the purpose of today's webinar, and then I'll go through some housekeeping rules shortly. So the Global South Dialogue on Economic Crime is an interdisciplinary platform for the advancement of knowledge sharing between Global South countries. And we are committed to making innovative and research-oriented responses to address complex crime challenges in the Global South. So our main area of focus is really the Global South, but we do look at other places too. The aim of today's proceedings is to critically examine over the next few hours the concepts of unexplained wealth orders, corruption, stolen assets, and illegal enrichment laws from an academic as well as a practitioner perspective. So today we will be joined not only by academics, but practitioners who are actively working in this particular field. The discussions today will take a global approach. I did share with everybody the agenda and also the booklet. So you'll see that actually we have a very stellar and rich panel of speakers who will be sharing their focus on different areas. So the discussions will take a global approach, and we will focus on HINEC, we'll focus on some individual jurisdictions and how these particular issues affect them in different ways. Our speakers will present their research-based thoughts, their opinions, their views, and the scope of the problem, resulting effects, and what we can do to encourage and enforce legislation in this particular area. It is our hope that by the end of this webinar, we would have contributed in a meaningful way that would lead to positive impact on the global discourse on unexplained wealth. I will therefore now hand over to Professor Nicholas Ryder, who will deliver our keynote speech and will take session one. Thank you.
Paula, how are you? Apologies for the interruption then, but thank you again for giving me this very kind invitation. I'll just share my screen with you so I can run through the customary slides. Well, good morning from now sunny Cardiff. Hopefully it'll be like that for the rest of the day. So my sort of 10-15 minute presentation is going to be does the UK's Economic Crime Transparency and Enforcement Act actually go far enough? So when Fuller invited me to give this keynote address, it was a question of trying to present an impartial overview of the UK's efforts to tackle financial crime, what the current threats, what the current trends are within an ever increasingly complicated area of law from a compliance perspective. So the usual caveat, the work is funded or has been funded by the Royal Limited Services Institute, Innovate UK for 3 projects, and our partners, Synology. So for all these presentations, apologies if I have to bore you with the research, although I'm very grateful for the research funders. So in terms of the abstract, I've been researching financial crime now for too long, possibly 2 decades, and it's a fascinating, ever-changing subject. And one of the key issues which attracted my attention 4 years ago was the UK's mutual evaluation report by the Financial Action Task Force. So the presentation offers perhaps an alternative viewpoint to those expressed by the British government in the last 4 years. So it tries to challenge and question the ratings provided by the FATF report and focuses on 2 particular case studies, both hopefully very timely and current. The first of which looks at corporate financial crime based on the Law Commission's recent discussion paper and options paper that was published 3-4 weeks ago. And then secondly looks at terrorism, financing and fraud. So by using those 2 particular case studies, it provides a rather, grim isn't the right word, but a rather dark image of the UK levels of complaints. And then it sort of finishes off by looking at the Economic Crime Act of 2022. And then does it actually go far enough? And do we need to maybe reflect as a country, government, advisors and so on, researchers about are we limited by perhaps a rather disjointed financial crime strategy? So briefly, I'll refer to the 2007 Mutual Evaluation Report. provide an overview of the UK's response, then refer to the 2018 Mutual Evaluation Report, and then present some evidence of questionable findings. The two case studies will look at corporate economic crime. Secondly, it will look at terrorism, financing and fraud. And then it'll offer a very brief overview of the Economic Crime Act and then offer some final thoughts for discussion before we move on to some fascinating panels for the rest of the conference. Apologies for the death by PowerPoint there, but I think you have to reflect in terms of what the British government or successive British governments have done since 2007. We strengthened the money laundering regime. The deficiencies in the fraud legislation have been reformed. We've now got the Fraud Act of 2006. The Bribery Act, to a varying degree of success, has imposed a number of high-profile deferred prosecution agreements. The next two pieces of law refer to primarily the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis and have created new criminal offences. But there is some questions, as, for example, as to whether the Financial Services Banking Reform Act has actually made any difference. If you look at Section 36 and reckless misconduct, where a director could be prosecuted if convicted, 7 years imprisonment. But of course, the bank has to go into liquidation. In 9 years of the Act, I don't believe any bank has gone into liquidation. So there are some issues there. The 2017 Criminal Finances Act, very influential with unexplained wealth orders, but also the exchange of information. We have the detailed Law Commission SARS review with 19 recommendations, which are in the process of being implemented. And then a variety of Law Commission reports, 3 national risk assessments, the economic crime plan, and a variety of discussion papers from the Law Commission. So that looks to be a very impressive and perhaps even robust stance towards tackling financial crime within the UK. Unsurprisingly, government ministers, John Glenn, who was the then Economic Secretary to the Treasury and City Minister, and Ben Wallace, now the Defence Minister, have praised the UK's robust stance towards financial crime, and of course have said in the House of Commons and in subsequent press releases that the UK is no place for dirty money. But there is a fair amount of literature which has begun to question the overall effectiveness of the UK's broader financial crime, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing strategy. There are 9 examples there, maybe 10 examples there for you. RUSI in 2018, we have the US Department of State's annual criticism of the UK. We've then got some very influential reports by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee entitled Gold Rush and Corruption in the UK. The detailed select committee reports by the HM Treasury, and more importantly, perhaps the Intelligence Security Committee of Parliament in its very damning 2020 Russia report, and more recently this year by Transparency International. So collectively, there is a fair amount of evidence which maybe could question the UK's status at the top of the league table. Now, from the first case studies perspective, and this is the topic that I've only come into in the last 4 or 5 years, but if we look at the background in terms of corporate financial crime, there are many leaks going back to the offshore leaks of 2013, the FIFA leaks, Swiss leaks, Bahamas, Panama Papers, Paris Papers, and Vincent Papers. I'm not going to go through all of those with you for now, but what is interesting is that the allegations contained in a lot of those leaks by the investigative journalists and sort of print media and online media, there's clearly an issue regarding misuse of funds, if I could put it that way, and UK, but also global-based corporations. So if this is a problem, what evidence can I present to maybe support the fact the opening statement of this presentation that the FATF MER findings are perhaps a little bit high? Well, if we look at the enforcement strategy of broadly for the UK, what we've seen last year is the first, and emphasize the first conviction of a UK bank for failing to comply with the 2007 money laundering regulations, a complete catastrophe of the internal reporting system by NatWest Bank, a record fine of £264.1 million, where the amount of money laundered was in excess of £350 million. There is the failed prosecution by Barclays Bank by the Serious Fraud Office, largely due to the restrictive common law rule of Tesco against NAPUS and the identification doctrine. I'd actually praise the SFO for bringing that case, but what it highlights are the common law rules are far too restrictive. To redress that problem, we have the failure to prevent model with the Bribery Act under Section 7 of the 2010 Bribery Act. I think we've got 12 DPAs in total, including convictions under Section 7. We then have the infamous Sections 45 and 46 for failing to prevent tax evasion. Bear in mind that a lot of the allegations in the previous slide relate to tax evasion. We have no DPAs under the Criminal Finances Act as of yet, which of course HMRC has attracted heavy criticism. To redress that, the Law Commission have sort of published their options paper on economic crime. But what we've also seen in the area is an increase of financial penalties imposed by the Financial Conduct Authority under Section 206(1) of FISMA 2000. Asset recovery also proves to be problematic in relation to where the convicted directors in Aquila Advisory Limited decided to hide the proceeds of tax fraud into the company, and the Supreme Court ruled last year, rather unsatisfactory in my opinion, that those assets could not be recovered. Briefly, I'm conscious of time, the second case study links into terrorism, financing and fraud. This is an ongoing project of mine. There are multiple sources that illustrate the link between terrorism, financing and fraud. Reports by the International Monetary Fund, the US Treasury Department, Europol, and so on and so on. But what we have found is that there is an emerging terrorism, financing, fraud typology. So within this paper that will be out later this year, I've identified a 12-point typology, which includes immigration fraud, tax fraud, mortgage fraud, student loan fraud, and so on. And if anybody wants any more information on that paper, I'd be very happy to put it in the chat for you. But if we're now able to identify fraud as a significant terrorism financing threat in the UK, what has the British government actually done about it? So we have, sadly, two very disjointed policies. Two figures for you to bear in mind, widely reported by the National Audit Office last year. Fraud accounts for 40% of all UK reported crime, and of that 40%, 54% is cyber enabled. So if we look at the fraud strategy, there are Criminal Justice Act, the creation of the Serious Fraud Office, the fraud review, multiple recommendations on how to actively report fraud. But of course, action fraud was embarrassingly wound up by the government 2 years ago, following an expose by the Times in relation to the very small number of investigations launched by reports to action fraud. So we don't have a fraud strategy. And where it has been referenced, there's no reference to terrorism financing, despite that emerging typology. If we look at the counter-terrorism financing strategy, and again, the UK has a long history, dates back to the 19th century, again, regarded by FATF as the best in the world. The legal framework is robust, but within context, which is the terrorism strategy, and the 3 national risk assessments, there is no reference to fraud. Yet the evidence suggests that multiple attacks in the UK in the past 15 years have been financed by that fraud typology. So what's intriguing to note is that within the paper, we able to identify that between 17 and 21% of all US terrorism convictions were for fraud. Over the same period in the UK, less than 3% of 116 terrorism convictions were for fraud. So hence the title for that phrase, we do have a very sadly disjointed policy. So in terms of my analysis and conclusions in relation to that particular case study, we would conclude that fraud is the funding mechanism of choice for terrorists in the UK. Why? It's convenient, low-key, and it frequently avoids detection. Just think how many police forces will actively, because of budgetary cuts, as we have seen in the last 12 years, actually investigate, for example, benefit fraud or student loan fraud or tax fraud. So terrorists have created what we've classified as a fraud dossier or a black book. And according to some secondary sources, you're able to access these particular books on the dark web. So what we have in place here is a rather disjointed policy. And still to this day, despite promises by the current government, we do not have a fraud strategy. So to redress some of these problems, the current government in March of this year implemented the Economic Crime Act of 2022. Broadly speaking, the Act covers three very important areas. It looks at the register of overseas entities. It seeks to improve the use of unexplained wealth orders, which I know a lot of people will be speaking about in the sessions today. And of course, it seeks to improve the sanctions regime. But what we have to consider is that despite the merits of introducing the Economic Crime Act, I have to question why the 8-year delay. This was first promised by David Cameron as part of the anti-corruption plan in 2014. So do we have apathy by central government? Remember, the Cabinet Office and the Home Office are given the responsibility of implementing and tackling private sector and public sector fraud. Yet why does the UK still in 2020, remember those two statistics from earlier, 40% of all UK crime is fraud-based, and over that, half is cyber-enabled. We still do not have a fraud strategy, and fraud, as this presentation has illustrated, is a threat to national security. Apathy, that's up to maybe people to debate over the course of today. And again, that raises then a rhetorical question: would the act have been introduced if Russia did not invade Ukraine? So I think Fola, that gives about 1 minute.
Well, thank you so much for that really insightful keynote. I'm sure that there will be questions, but just before we dig right in, I'm probably going to abuse hostess privilege here. So you mentioned about the Economic and Transparency Act and the 8-year delay. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on how effective you think this act is going to be. I take your point that yes, if for the Russian war, would they have actually have introduced it? So it would be great to just hear some thoughts on that, please.
Yes, like doing a PhD vibe again. Thank you for that, I remember that question. That's a great question. I think in terms of its effectiveness, it does redress some of the major flaws, I think, within the sanctions regime in terms of unexplained wealth orders. I think an intriguing part, I think in the last 2 years, a lot of us have been to online events and it's been great to speak to more people. And I think the conclusion I'm coming to is that a lot of the enforcement mechanisms exist. We've got asset recovery, unexplained wealth orders, prosecution of corporations, but it's the frequency of their use. So I think from my perspective, it's about leadership. And, the two primary government departments, the Home Office, and, they do a very, very difficult job. I appreciate that. But I think it's about having a clear strategy with clear goals and adequate funding. And I think that, what we have seen with the SFO asking for more money, the NCAs having massive issues with the SARS regime for money laundering, it's flawed, it's broken. They're looking for, I think, an increase of spending of 300%. So I think for me that the effectiveness of the legislation will depend on what financial support the government will provide. So, for example, in relation to tackling fraud, which according to Professor Mark Button from Portsmouth University is worth £190 billion a year, the government invests as little as £300 million. So if you are really going to make an indent in terms of lack of revenue collection by HMRC or a variety of private sector frauds, there has to be that funding up front with then adequate personnel to tackle it. So I think that they would be two massive factors which will, in 3 or 4 years, maybe when we reflect on the act and what it's done, I think we're probably in a better position then to maybe assess it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I've got a question here, which I will share. Is it according to you, improvement, well-being and reducing social disparities can reduce dimensions of financial terrorism and fraud? So that's a question for you, Nick. Shall I read the question out again?
Yeah, if you could please, that would be lovely. Yeah, thank you.
Is it according to you that the improvement and well-being and reducing of social disparities can reduce dimensions of financial terrorism and fraud?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think anything in terms of social inequality is extremely important, and there are researchers who are better qualified than myself in terms of to make probably sort of more accurate statements. But I think what we find in relation to, it's difficult to see within terrorism, but I can see within fraud is that what you will find at high levels of we've had I'm probably fortunate enough to have done my doctorate within consumer law in a previous life, many years ago. And so I can answer that question. That what I was able to find is that levels of debt would increase by £1 million every 4 minutes in the UK. So for every consumer lecture I give, going back 15 years ago, over 60 minutes, that's £50 million added to levels of consumer debt. So what we will find, especially in the current cost of living crisis and all of the difficulties that people are facing in terms of post-pandemic, the uncertainty about our own finances, it's likely that people are going to be presented with advantages of maybe trying to commit crime to pay for food and to pay for rent. So I think we are going to see, sadly, an increase of social inequality could lead to, but again, I'm not a criminologist, so I couldn't really answer. Now, in terms of terrorism, that's maybe more of a difficult question to answer, because what I think we've got to bear in mind here is that that there is a perception amongst the press that they always distinguish international terrorism to domestic terrorism. They'll use the phrase Islamic-based terrorism, overseas jihadis, but ultimately a terrorist is a terrorist, whether they're left-wing, right-wing, ultranationals, or whatever part of the world they're from. So I think we have to be very careful how we target and classify terrorists. To me, a terrorist is a terrorist if they're a right-wing person involved in the attack on Capitol Hill in January of last year, or whether they're involved in, sadly, mass shootings in America, which the Americans really struggled to identify as domestic terrorism, which escapes me. I don't understand why. So fraud, yes, but I'm a little bit probably not qualified enough to say in relation to the terrorism part. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the terrorist aspect of the question is a bit more complex and not as easy to answer. It's not as straightforward. But thank you. We've got time for one more question. I think, well, actually two more, and then I will let you start your session. What could be done at a global level to curb illicit financial gain and unexplained wealth linked to foreign heads of state and public officers? That's an interesting one.
That's a PhD title itself, isn't it? Wow.
It is actually, isn't it?
Where are these bombs coming from? Where's one gone? So I think that, yeah, it's about international cooperation. I think that's a must. I think if you look at and again, from my own experience of supervising PhD students and not necessarily writing in the area, but if you look at just the horrific cases in terms of illicit financial flow out of developing economies, and a lot of that money ends up in the UK. I wrote a paper on this in 2008, and it was looking at the exploits of Sinai Abacha. I'm sure some of you will know more than I will about the billions of pounds that was laundered into the UK. Yes. And there was an FSA investigation in 2000 into this, a very small highlighted investigation. And they concluded that the 23 banks in their investigation, 15 had weak levels of anti-money laundering compliance, so about 60%. Of those banks, 0 were fined. Now, I find that just embarrassing and absolutely shambolic. And yet NatWest is fined £250 million last year. Deutsche Bank is fined £173 million for low levels of complaint. But when you've actually got money laundering, yes, okay, it's like a parent, for example, sort of, will get up the glasses and sort of do that to you.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, it is about international cooperation. But again, I'm not an expert in terms of some developing economies, but they do appear to be sadly abused by public officials. But again, it's the FATF members have to step up, realize that those developing economies do need more support, do need more time to comply with the FATF standards, and shouldn't automatically be placed on the grey list, for example.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. So we do have one more question, but what I'll do is reserve that for the Q&A session in panel Q&A segment in session 1, I beg your pardon. So if we can make a start with session 1, I think our speakers are here. So I'm Clancy is the first, and I will hand over back to you, Nick.
Great, thank you, Fola. So now you've listened to the worst part, that's me out the way, thankfully now, and we can move on to 4 more fantastic speakers for this afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Annie Clancy from Queen Mary, London University. Her research interests, I was looking at this morning, criminal law, criminal proceeds, international criminal law, and white-collar crime. What more can you want in terms of someone's research areas of expertise? Annie, the floor is yours, and thank you for presenting for us today.
Okay, yes. First of all, Fola and the co-founders of the Global South Dialogue on Economic Crime, thanks a million for having me along today. The purpose of this talk is to, I suppose, follow on quite nicely from Nick's talk to look at one specific aspect that he mentioned when it comes to countering corruption, which is looking at unexplained wealth orders, which were introduced pursuant to the Financial Crimes Act 2017 in the UK, and which allow enforcement authorities in circumstances where someone holds wealth that doesn't seem consistent with their lawful known income, where, for example, you're a civil servant who makes, say, $60,000 a year, yet owns in central London property worth many tens of millions. In those circumstances, it allows enforcement authorities in the UK to apply to the High Court to have the owners of those properties explain how exactly did they manage to afford those properties, and to the extent that they can't provide a credible presumption will rise, a legal presumption, an evidential presumption will arise that those properties are the proceeds of crime, are the proceeds of unlawful conduct, and can therefore be made the subject of civil recovery orders and therefore seized by the state. Before I get into kind of unexplained wealth orders in detail, it's worth kind of setting out the context in which unexplained wealth orders became part of the law in the UK. They were introduced at a time where there was a lot of discussion about the proceeds of global political corruption in particular being funneled into the City of London and used to purchase high value properties there. It came off the back of David Cameron, who was then the Prime Minister, holding a global anti-corruption summit in London in the summer of 2016. It came very shortly after the leaking of the Panama Papers, which Nick mentioned in his talk, which amongst other things showed that 12 different heads of state held interests in Panamanian properties, and 143 parliamentarians from around the world held interests in Panamanian properties, which they were then using to buy assets in other jurisdictions. And the measure was also introduced shortly after Transparency International did research highlighting the amount of property in central London held by offshore companies, the owners, the beneficial owners of which were unknown. So that was the kind of the political context in which all this came up. And the property essentially, the unexplained wealth order essentially through its introduction in Parliament, when it was introduced, the government set it had four main purposes. First of all, it was introduced to deter the laundering of the proceeds of, amongst other things, overseas corruption through the UK property market. Secondly, it was aimed to the extent that that property was recovered off the bat of unexplained wealth orders to repatriate those assets to the countries from which those resources had been stolen or embezzled from. Thirdly, they said that introducing unexplained wealth orders was really important in terms of making a statement that the UK was against corruption more generally, and that it would not be open to admitting the proceeds of corruption into the UK. And finally, and from a practical perspective, the purpose of unexplained wealth orders was to essentially shift the requirement to explain where whether assets were criminally or legally acquired onto the person who holds those assets, and to the extent that they can't explain that those assets were illicitly acquired, to then raise a presumption of unlawful property. And in that way, the idea was that you would reduce the investigative burden of enforcement authorities in trying to prove first that a crime was committed overseas, then that the proceeds of that crime was siphoned into the UK, and third, then that the relevant property constituted the proceeds of a particular crime. in terms of anticipated outcomes on its introduction, the Unexplained Wealth Order was expected, according to the government's impact statement, to be used in 20 different investigations a year. And so far, in the 4.5 years since Unexplained Wealth Orders have been introduced, they have been used in a grand total of 4 investigations. So they have wildly underperformed in practice, and we'll get on to the reasons for that in a few minutes. And in terms of those 4 investigations, only 3 of those investigations have proven in any way successful. The 4th was thrown out by the High Court on the basis that the claims that the National Crime Agency had made in submitting its case were flawed in the eyes of the judge. So in the round, we can say that to date in the UK, the experience has been that Unexplained Wealth Orders have, broadly speaking, not been a success, again, for reasons that I'll get onto. So if we go on to, if we go to slide 2, yeah, we're slide 2, perfect. The second one, Unexplained Wealth Orders in Practice. As I've mentioned, they are sought by criminal law enforcement authorities. So that includes the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, HMRC, that's Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and also the Crown Prosecution Service can seek unexplained wealth orders. The applications are generally made on an ex parte basis, and they're usually accompanied by applications seizing freezing of particular properties and freezing of, thereby ensuring that assets cannot be dissipated while the Unexplained Wealth Order process is in train. Generally, initial applications are also made on an unreported basis. Because to the extent that someone holds unexplained wealth but then has a completely credible explanation as to how they lawfully acquired their assets, it seems reasonable that their reputations shouldn't be trashed by association with the fact that an unexplained wealth order was made against them. And once again, the rationale behind it generally is that it is much easier for someone who owns a property to explain and legitimate how they managed to acquire that property than it is for enforcement authorities to establish that a property was not acquired licitly. There's 2 schools of thought around this from a kind of a general civil liberties perspective. The first school of thought is that, or people who are pro unexplained wealth orders would say, financial crime and the proceeds of financial crime is a special case when it comes to investigations, because there are high levels of opacity around how properties are held. It's extremely difficult to investigate without special powers being available to investigate how people acquired property. And the courts have said that asking someone to explain how they managed to acquire an asset is no more than, and I quote, modest intrusion into the privacy of an individual. The other school of thought, or people who have some misgivings potentially about unexplained wealth orders, would say that it is a civil form of recovery, but it is essentially a state-made claim. Crime enforcement authorities are coming to people and saying, we are suspicious, we don't trust that you came by this property through legitimate means. And that's, respondents to unexplained wealth orders do risk having their reputations being trashed, even if subsequently it transpires that the enforcement authority bringing the case against them perhaps didn't have a very strong case. And this is really well illustrated in the case of the Unexplained Wealth order that collapsed. That involves the National Crime Agency taking a case in respect of properties owned by the head of the Senate of Kazakhstan and her son. And even though the High Court ultimately discharged the orders and said that they had been improperly provided in the first instance, or had been provided, sorry, on an unsubstantiated, insufficiently substantiated basis, nevertheless, the head of the Kazakhstani Senate subsequently lost her job because it was a bad look that she was in any way being associated with unexplained wealth orders at all. So they're the kind of the two varying the pros and cons, I guess, of unexplained wealth orders, very, very broadly speaking. So if we go on to slide 3, which is the statutory tests, I'll just quickly explain what, so that's, thanks. Yeah, perfect. The statutory tests where an enforcement authority is to obtain an unexplained wealth order. The High Court will give an enforcement authority an unexplained wealth order first if it can establish that the respondent actually holds the property, that is, they're either the beneficial or the legal registered owner of the property. Secondly, the property in question needs to be worth at least £50,000. Thirdly, the respondent needs to be a politically exposed person. So a politically exposed person is someone who holds, who is a high-ranking public official, or someone who is a family member or otherwise connected to that high-ranking public official, or someone who is connected suspected of involvement in serious crime, or someone who is connected to such a person. The fourth test that needs to be established is that there are reasonable grounds for suspecting either that person's lawfully obtained income is incommensurate with the assets that they hold, or that the property has been obtained through unlawful conduct. So that is a brief overview of the key issues with unexplained wealth orders. If we just hop to the last slide, here we'll get on to the key criticisms around unexplained wealth orders and the kind of the lessons to be learned from the UK experience. First of all, I've already explained that there are kind of broad rights criticisms of civil recovery, more generally kind of state-made claims of suspected criminality simply because the providence rather of someone's asset isn't immediately obvious. That's somewhat problematic. Secondly, the definition of PEPs in the legislation establishing unexplained wealth orders has been criticised as both too broadly and too narrowly defined. It's been criticised as too broadly defined because it covers the usual suspects: heads of state, heads of government, finance ministers, and so forth. But it also extends to everyone who's on the board of directors of a publicly owned company, everyone who's a member of parliament who might not have any access to public funds whatsoever, they might just be a parliamentarian, all members of the judiciary, and all of those individuals, family members, and everyone who's kind of a close associate of those people. So to put that in context, in the UK, for example, there are 800 members of the House of Lords. If you include all of their family members and all of their close associates, you've got this exponential explosion of people who could potentially be PEPs in the UK. The other side of the coin is, the argument is this incredibly expansive definition of PEPs dilutes the potency, because focus is kind of diluted away from the main people who have the ability, the motive, and the opportunity to steal money from states' coffers. It's also seen as too narrowly defined, however, because first of all, in the UK, unexplained wealth orders against PEPs are not available against UK and EEA PEPs. The rationale, I think, being that there are already misconduct laws within the UK. It's not entirely clear what the rationale behind the EEA PEPs being left out are, but also the definition of family members within PEPs disregards, for example, the realities of the fact that certain global leaders we have recently learned may have undisclosed children or partners that are not kind of publicly on the record, and that's a little controversial potentially as well.
Just got 1 minute to go, if that's okay.
Oh, okay. So two final general things, and these are actually completely repeating what Nick said in terms of his general criticisms. First of all, unexplained wealth orders really aren't terribly effective in practice. What you need is massive structural change across the board in terms of corporate transparency, in terms of better regulation, in terms of introducing a fraud strategy and joined up thinking. So to the extent that the politicians say we are doing something about corruption, it shouldn't be relied on that. And the second main criticism is you need broad funding, enforcement, and expertise, money poured into it, and political support and leadership around that for unexplained wealth orders to truly work in practice. Thanks very much.
That was great, thank you. And I think you've actually got some, I'm glad I'm not answering these questions. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. Really informative. And I think it gives a really fascinating discussion of unexplained wealth orders. And yeah, so a couple of questions in the chat. Bear with me while I just get these out.
Nick, I wonder if we could take the questions at the end of the session. Would that be okay?
Yeah, more than happy to. Yeah,
fantastic.
Absolutely fine. Yeah, no problem. Okay. Well, thank you for the presentation, Annie. That was just really fascinating because I've listened to that for about a few more hours. So yeah, so thank you. That was a great presentation. I'm going to move on now to our second speaker in the first session. It is Dr. Ilari Zavoli from the University of Leeds, and she's an expert in money laundering amongst cryptocurrencies, criminal justice. And published a fantastic paper last year in the Modern Law Review looking at money laundering, and I believe it was the real estate sector. Yes. I think a lot of my students have enjoyed reading that, as I have as well. So the floor is yours. Nice to see you again, and thanks for presenting for us today.
Right. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for this brilliant opportunity to present about unexplained wealth orders, in particular with a focus on real estate. As Nicholas was saying, I can say a little bit of an expert in this specific sector. I've been looking at this for some years now, and I also had a look at not just money laundering in real estate, but also money laundering in real estate and cryptocurrencies. And now I'm also looking at money laundering in the construction industry. So like different sectors that might have some things in common. So this is the plan for my presentation. So I will just give you a little bit of an overview of the problem that we have in the UK specifically with real estate. It's not just really the UK. I would say it's a worldwide problem, widespread in different countries with money laundering in the real estate sectors, because it's a very lucrative sector. It's a market that is targeted by criminals because they can really launder millions of dollars, of pounds or euros into these specific properties. And then I will see, and I will just give you an overview of this relationship between the unexplained wealth orders that are now in place in the UK and money laundering in the real estate market, and the fight against money laundering in this specific sector, and a little bit of an idea of what the future might bring us and what might be new areas for research I would like to also pursue. So this is the scale of the problem. So generally speaking, the UK, there are estimates, because we can't have like specific figures, of money laundering being £100 billion every year. So in different sectors, it's not just real estate, it could be financial sector, it could be the art market, it could be cryptocurrencies. So it's a very big and important problem. And in particular, with the latest figures from Transparency International, we talk about £6.7 billion that are dodgy money and that might be linked to money laundering in the real estate market. So again, the real estate market, it's a huge problem within a bigger problem. And of this, there is, again, Transparency International has given an estimate of £1.5 billion bought by Russians accused of corruption or links to the Kremlin. So as also Nick was saying before, the new act has been introduced to specifically target Russians, corrupted elite, but the problem was already there in the previous years. So it's not like a new thing, it's not a new phenomenon, but we have been seeing this for years. So it's a very lucrative sector, as I was saying. And as also the National Risk Assessment Report of 2020 is explicitly saying, in the UK, there has been an increase of overseas buyers that are investing inverted commas, into the real estate market in the UK, and they're bringing a lot of cash and a lot of dirty money into the UK real estate economy. And there has been this huge increase, huge amount of money that is flooding the UK, but at the same time, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the resources really to tackle these huge problems. So there has been an increase of investigative resources constraints that are really limiting the capacity for enforcement agencies to tackle the problem. And it's not just a question of corrupt foreign elites, but it's also a question of organized crimes. And we will see this in a moment with unexplained wealth orders. So throughout the years, there has been an increase also in the risk associated with real estate and money laundering in the real estate market in the UK. So as you can see here, and again, this is an extract from the National Risk Assessment Report of 2020, has been an increase in how this market, this sector is evaluated from medium low to high medium. So we had an increase because there has been additional issues that have, let's say, characterized the real estate market, including the new subjects that are providing services in the market, for instance, letting agents, but also online agents, the use of cryptocurrency, so additional challenges that are at stake, that are on the table, plus the fact that, as you can see from this slide, and I tried to do my best to visualize this for you, there has been still a very low number of suspicious activity reports that have been filed throughout the years by real estate agents, compared to other sectors, for instance, the credit institutions and banking sectors, where we are talking about 432,000 SARS in 2019-2020, compared to 861 in the real estate market. So there is a huge difference, a huge gap between real estate market, real estate sector, and the raising of red flags and reports in this sector compared to the financial one. So these are, as also Aine was talking about, that very recent cases of money laundering in the real estate sectors, where we also, through the Pandora Papers, for instance, we got to know with these links of a lot of foreign elites that are investing money, sometimes corrupt money, dirty money, into the UK real estate market. And when the unexplained orders came into place, so they were introduced at the end of January 2018, Transparency International immediately, the same day, actually published this on the right side of the slide. That is a list of suspicious properties that enforcement agencies like NCA could look at and just start investigating, because they think that there has been something ongoing beyond the purchase of this multi-million, as you can see, properties in London and other areas in the UK. So this was something that was the background, if you want, to the introduction of unexplained wealth orders and how this then linked to the real estate market in the UK. So there have been a lot of expectations, I would say, about unexplained wealth orders. So Aine had explained to you in detail how they work and how they are obtained and what is the ultimate result of unexplained wealth orders. But the problem is that the expectations that the Home Office in their assessment reports before introducing the unexplained wealth orders in the UK have not really been met when these unexplained wealth orders have been used in practice. So they estimated that, for instance, the, let's say, costs for enforcement agencies would not be that much, and also that they could have had 20 cases per year. So 20 unexplained wealth orders given every year to tackle, again, money laundering in the UK. However, these were just expectations. It was just like prospective views on what could be the future of unexplained wealth orders. And these were also shared, not just by the Home Office, but also by the literature. So when I was looking at different scholars talking about this before the introduction of orders, we actually had these expectations. They could be really like a life-changing, if you want, tool in the hands of enforcement agencies. However, reality kicks in, and we had throughout time again, even the enforcement agencies have started to realize that there were huge issues with the practical implementation of UVOs, but also with the possibility for UVOs to be an effective tool in the hands of enforcement agencies to tackle money laundering, in particular in the real estate market. So as you can see here, I just put some quotes that throughout the years, including recently March 2022, governmental agencies, MCA, have expressed concerns about the possibility to use UVOs, but also they have started being more careful as to how they present UVOs and how they present this possibility to tackle money laundering with unexplained wealth orders. So they started from saying, we will have 20 per year, to actually reducing this because of the reality of how many cases. I was saying like just 4 cases and 9 UVOs in total, but also because of the costs associated with cases, in particular one that didn't go as planned. And then NSA was asked to actually pay £1.5 million as compensation. So this is the reality again. So 9 UVOs so far in 4 cases since January 2018. No unexplained wealth orders from since the end of 2019. So in the past 3 years, none has been given or asked for. And as you can see here, just like created this table where you can see where more or less these properties are located. They are geographically limited, also mainly England and Wales. There's just 2 properties in Northern Ireland. And also, it's interesting for me to see that the majority of UVOs, actually all UVOs, relate to real estate properties. Although, as someone was also asking in the Q&A section, these do not actually pertain just real estate. So it could be property intended broadly also as including money and also intangible assets. So that's interesting for me because it looks like national enforcement agencies actually want to tackle real estate properties because they might think that they can get the most out of UVOs, and also because they think that this might look like a successful result if the UVOs is granted and then the person actually loses the possibility to use this to launder money. One case that has been successful, particularly successful, is the Hussein case of 2019, where this money laundering really, there was laundering money for criminal organizations in the Leeds Bradford area, was then forced to give up 45 properties that were around almost £10 million in value to National Crime Agency because of UVO that was just given against him. So that's interesting for me, and this is also the last bit I would like to discuss with you today, because as you can see from this table, you can see that there is a difference in terms of PPs being involved in the UVO and instead organized crime people being involved. And it seems that so far, although we have very, very few cases, again, just 4 cases, the most successful cases are when organized crimes people are targeted rather than politically exposed persons. They might have the money, they might have the financial resources and time to actually contest UVOs, to actually contest the evidential, let's say, framework that has been created by National Crime Agency to use the UVO and to ask for the UVO. So this is interesting for me because it looks like, and the question that I have is, well, then, could it be that UVOs are actually a tool, not for all type of targeted criminals, including PAPs and organized crimes people, but just like perhaps more for organized criminals, organized crime organizations, because these actually rely on properties to, for instance, show off their money, to show off their, let's say, power, if you want, compare instead to politically exposed persons that are really investing simply to take the money that they got from, for instance, corruption abroad and then investing into the UK real estate market. So they don't really care about this question of, let's say, this value of the properties beyond the economic value, but also the value of the property to showcase their power. So that's an interesting question for me. So there, just to conclude, just to give you an idea of what the future might bring, as also Nicholas was talking about, there is this Economic Crime Transparency Enforcement Act that has tried to tackle some of the issues, including the costs of the proceedings for instance, MCA, when things go wrong. But the question still remains, is the anti-money laundering regime in the UK up to the task? And Are Ubers actually an effective tool to tackle money laundering in the UK real estate market? Because they have been really like just, and as Ayn was saying, not really used that much. So they are very limited cases. And so the successful rate, if you want, the success rate of the use of Ubers is extremely low. So two last points here, food for thought and I would be very happy to take questions on this. First of all, how much is too little? Because if you look at the very recent declarations from NCA about the use of Ubers, it seems to me that they really want us not to look at the monetary value alone of the Ubers, but they really want to look at the use of Ubers as a tool to change society, to tackle economic crimes, including money laundering, in order to have like a knock-on effect on, and so also, if you want, ripple effect on other economic crimes that are happening in the UK. But is this true? So are we sure that the Ubers will be used actually for less valuable operations or less valuable properties that are the target of Ubers? And the second point is there any difference in the effectiveness of Ubers when these are targeting PPs compared to organized crime people? Because as I said, it seems to me that at least in the Hussein case, it was ready, even if it presented evidence in his favor, he still then was forced to give up 45 properties, even if at the very beginning the Uber against him was just for 8 properties. So it seems to me that it might be more successful, more effective as a tool if it is used against organized crime rather than PPs that have again the money, the resources, and the capacity to fight and to contest Ubers, and so to really drag enforcement agencies like MCA into a very lengthy and very costly proceedings.
Thanks for presenting a really interesting overview on unexplained wealth orders and the property market. I know I wish I'd bought property about 20 years ago when I can actually maybe retire at the end of this week. Would be quite nice. Anyway, I've got time, I think, to try and take a couple of questions. So apologies if I miss some out. I know we've got some at the end. We've had a question from Tibogo. All parliamentaries required to make declarations of assets they hold. Does it include offshore assets?
That's a good question. Well, this could be true in certain countries, not every country. So some of these cases that were, again, like the focus of Ubers actually pertain public figures that were not really politicians. So in the proper sense, that would actually link to prime ministers or to political figures in their home countries, but they were not politicians themselves. So that was also one of the questions that were asked to the High Court to clarify. So what do we mean, as Ayn was saying, by politically exposed persons, but also when we have then family members, how can we make sure that the income requirement, so this is one of the requirements of Ubers, is not actually explained, so it's suspicious, is dodgy, so it could actually bring the question of how these people actually obtain the wealth that they have to purchase these properties. So it's true that in some countries, politicians have to declare this, but not all countries, first of all, and also it's not that we have traditionally, we don't actually have a politician that is buying the property directly, but is using, for instance, offshore companies, or it's using other people in whose names then the properties are bought. That's why, as Nick, you were saying at the very beginning, the introduction of the ultimate beneficial ownership register for foreign companies owning property in the UK might be interesting. I'm not saying it might be, a life-changing tool, because we have to see how it's going to be used, but definitely interesting because it might help to clarify who's actually beyond a certain transaction, who is actually the ultimate beneficial owner of that property in the UK.
I'm on mute, what a surprise. One last question before we go to our next speaker. We've had a question from Shamal. Hope I pronounced that correctly. According to you, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on the real estate market in the UK and beyond?
Excellent question. This again has to be seen. So there has been definitely a decrease in the growth of the sector. So many transactions have not gone through, obviously, because there has been a lack of face-to-face relationship between, for instance, real estate agents and their clients. But that doesn't mean the criminals have not actually exploited the system, right? So for instance, with fraud, Nick, you might know better than I do, has been actually, we saw really like a spike, an increase in the numbers of fraudsters actually exploiting the COVID-19 situation. With money laundering in the real estate market, I would say that one thing that definitely could have happened and has happened, I could see this from the data and from the literature, is, first of all, that we have online letting agents. So actually, the lack of face-to-face relationship with real estate agents was not really a problem, and actually could be exploited by criminals to infiltrate the system even more, because less checks could be done, or the checks were more difficult without seeing the person in real life. And also the use of cryptocurrencies, for instance, to purchase property in the real estate market in the UK, there was a phenomenon already starting before the pandemic, has actually increased. So we saw, I think it was like 30% increase in the use of cryptocurrencies for purchasing properties in the UK real estate market, exactly because of the lack of the possibility to have face-to-face interaction with real estate agents. So people actually invest using cryptocurrencies, using online tools, so they don't really care to be seen, to be there present in the firm of the real estate agent.
That's great, thank you. So thank you for that wonderful presentation, and thank you for answering the questions from, over 200 participants, which is not easy. It's quite intimidating when you've got a list of names on the screen and sort of, people posing great questions. Well, Larry, thank you for that great presentation, and great to see you virtually again. So I'm going to move on and invite our third speaker today, which is Andrew Dornberrier from the Basel Institute of Governance. Andrew, welcome to the panel. Andrew is a senior asset recovery specialist within the International Centre for Asset Recovery, and he is the author of the 2021 Illicit Environment, A Guide to Targeting Unexplained Wealth. Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you for giving us your talk today.
Thanks for the intro, Nick. As Nick mentioned, I work for the International Centre for Asset Recovery, which is a division of something called the Basel Institute on Governance. And that's a not-for-profit foundation that focuses mainly on anti-corruption and providing support to governments around the world and law enforcement agencies around the world on anti-corruption issues. As part of my work with the Institute, I've had a lot of exposure to illicit enrichment laws in both a practical sense and a research sense. For instance, for about 3 years, I was working alongside investigators in Tanzania at the anti-corruption agency there, where I was predominantly assisting them to investigate cases relating to offences of illicit enrichment, or as it's known in Tanzania, actually, the possession of unexplained wealth. This whole experience in Tanzania actually got me very interested in the topic. So I decided to embark on a big, giant research exercise into illicit enrichment to understand better how countries around the world draft illicit enrichment laws, how these laws have been enforced by law enforcement agencies around the world, and also how they have, of course, been adjudicated by courts. The product of all this research was actually this book. Please to the next slide.
And I'm going to share the slides for you, so just let me know when you want me to move across.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So the product of all this research, like I said, was this book here, which is on the slide. And today I'm mainly going to talk about one of the key areas that is in this book, which is the question of whether or not illicit enrichment laws around the world conflict with established legal rights. Before I launch into that hefty discussion, though, I want to take a quick moment to define exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about illicit enrichment laws. Okay, so there's really just a lot of confusion and a lot of debate surrounding how to actually define illicit enrichment laws, and to be honest, this debate is probably worthy of a presentation of its own. So I won't really have a lot of time to go into it. It's an understandable confusion. It's an understandable debate because a lot of different countries around the world basically use a wide range of terminology to refer to what is essentially the same legal topic. But at least for today, to give everyone a little bit of scope to my presentation, I'm just going to take a moment to explain what I'm talking about when I mention an illicit enrichment law. So when I wrote the book, yeah, just this one still for the moment, thanks. When I wrote the book, I used a very broad definition of illicit enrichment laws. And I'm going to use that definition today as well. So specifically, when I talk about illicit enrichment laws, I'm talking about laws that empower a court to impose a final judicial sanction against a person if they are satisfied that the person has enjoyed an amount of wealth of some kind that has not been justified through reference to that person's lawful income. And really importantly, when I talk about illicit enrichment laws, I'm talking about laws that can impose these sanctions without any need whatsoever for a state to show proof that there was any separate or underlying criminal activity. So in other words, there's no need for a state to actually prove any sort of criminal offence. This final point is really important. It's the characteristic of illicit enrichment laws that distinguish them from other proceeds of crime mechanisms, such as, say, civil forfeiture laws, civil recovery laws, which require assets involved in these proceedings to be linked to criminality on the balance of probabilities, or also, say, like extended criminal confiscation laws, which of course require a conviction before they can be applied. It's also a pretty important characteristic because it gives rise to a lot of the criticism, obviously, that these types of laws attract. And particularly it gives rise to a lot of criticism surrounding the fact that, or surrounding the question that whether or not these laws actually violate established legal rights, which is what I'm obviously going to talk about today. A final point before I do, when I'm talking about illicit enrichment laws today, I'm talking about criminal versions of these laws. So criminal illicit enrichment laws, which are laws that are based in criminal procedure, which result in criminal punishments if a person is shown to have illicitly enriched themselves. I won't really have time today to talk about the relationship between legal rights and civil versions of these laws, which are known more commonly, say, as unexplained wealth declarations or unexplained property orders. But I just want to shamelessly plug my book and say I do talk about that in my book quite a lot. So if you are interested in that type of thing, please read the book. So the golden question for today is, do criminal illicit enrichment laws violate established legal rights? So it's a really common claim that they do. It's often a reason that legislators use as an excuse to basically not introduce these types of laws into their jurisdictions. And even when a legislator does introduce these types of laws into their jurisdiction, as soon as a law enforcement agency tries to enforce one of these laws, it's often a claim that's raised by lawyers to try and challenge these types of laws in the courts. And the challenges are basically always along the same lines, that these types of laws violate, say, the presumption of innocence principle, the right to silence, the privilege against self-incrimination, or the principle against retroactive application. So the question is, do these laws actually violate any of these principles? It's not a simple answer, obviously, but for the most part, and I'm going to stress this, for the most part, whenever these laws have been challenged on these grounds, the courts have pretty much always found that these laws are compatible with existing legal rights. So I'm going to explain that a bit further, and I'll go through a couple of these legal rights individually and provide a bit more of an in-depth explanation. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So obviously, one of the main grounds for challenging these types of laws is that illicit enrichment laws allegedly violate the principle of the presumption of innocence. Remember how I said that an illicit enrichment law does not require the state to show proof of any underlying or connected criminal activity? Well, critics claim that this characteristic effectively permits a court to make a presumption that certain items of wealth were obtained by the person in question through unlawful sources. And the critics argue that the creation of this presumption unfairly reverses the burden of proof onto an accused person in an illicit enrichment trial, which requires them and which obligates them to produce evidence to a certain standard that establishes the non-criminal sources of their wealth. Okay. And strangely, when these arguments are raised, most courts agree with them partially. They often rule that criminal illicit enrichment laws in their jurisdictions do give rise to a presumption that certain items of wealth were not lawfully sourced. Okay. They also agree that a burden in an illicit enrichment trial can effectively be placed on an accused person to rebut this presumption, right? And even more interestingly, a lot of the courts acknowledge that this presumption, the reverse burden, actually does run contrary to the presumption of innocence principle. However, the vast majority of these courts have also deemed that these laws are actually acceptable legal mechanisms. So the question obviously arises, how do the courts justify this? Well, the overwhelming majority of courts that have looked at this issue have taken the view that the presumption of innocence principle is not actually absolute in nature, and that it's actually acceptable to have exceptions to this principle in certain special circumstances. There's actually quite a lot of precedent on this issue outside of an illicit enrichment context, including cases from the European Court of Human Rights. And this precedent all says the same things, that basically it's possible for a law to include an exception or a deviation from the presumption of innocence principle in certain special circumstances. Okay, and what amounts to an acceptable circumstance, of course, differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But there are some recurring examples that have come up around the world. Some courts, for instance, have deemed that illicit enrichment-based presumptions are acceptable exceptions to the presumption of innocence principle on the basis that these presumptions are in the public interest, specifically in the context of corruption and the fact that these presumptions are designed to, say, help combat corruption. Other courts have also justified illicit enrichment-based presumptions as acceptable deviations from the presumption of innocence principle on the basis that the facts required by a person to rebut the presumption in a proceeding of this kind are facts that are specifically within the knowledge of that person. Okay. Other courts again have justified these types of presumptions as acceptable in the context of the presumption of innocence on the basis that the illicit enrichment proceedings as a whole still require the state to prove the fundamental facts of an accusation, regardless of whether or not a presumption is made and a burden is switched onto a person to justify their assets. So the state is still required to actually prove, fundamentally their accusation. In fact, when courts do sort of deal with this question, they don't just use one of the reasons I just mentioned, they actually generally use a combination of these reasons. So it's not usual that one of these reasons alone is enough to justify an illicit enrichment law in the context of presumption of innocence. It's usually a combination. So the idea that the presumption of innocence principle is not absolute and there can be exceptions is just one of the key reasonings that's used by courts to justify illicit enrichment laws in the context of the presumption of innocence. There's another view which is quite different and which is more common to civil systems. So not civil law procedure, but civil systems. Can we just go to the next slide, please? So remember how I said that some courts, in the last example, accept that presumptions are made in illicit enrichment proceedings that certain assets were acquired illegally and that a burden is placed on a person to justify the legality of these assets. There are courts around the world that don't think that this is what's happened at all. So these courts are in countries like Argentina or Lithuania, and they instead provide a pretty simple sort of answer to the question of whether or not these laws violate the presumption of innocence principle. They say that basically in proceedings under an illicit enrichment law in their jurisdiction, it's completely up to the state alone to prove that illicit enrichment has taken place. So this doesn't mean that the state has to prove that certain assets have come from illegal sources, but it's completely up to the state to prove that the assets that they're looking at are disproportionate to a person's lawful income and that there is no justification for this disproportionate role. Therefore, in trials in these countries for illicit enrichment, the accused person is never actually required to bear any burden whatsoever. And therefore, the illicit enrichment laws in these countries are considered to be still completely in line with established legal rights, such as the presumption of innocence. Overall, however, the justifications provided on this particular issue and the wider arguments that I've just mentioned, they're obviously a lot more in depth, and the reasoning from the courts are a lot more in depth than what I've been able to say today. So obviously, please have a read of my book as I go into these arguments all in a lot more detail. So just moving on quickly in the last sort of remaining minutes that I have, I just wanted to quickly address whether illicit enrichment laws violate the right to silence or the privilege against self-incrimination. To be honest, this specific question hasn't really been tested in courts that much. However, you can get a little bit of guidance from other cases involving other laws, not illicit enrichment laws. And this guidance suggests that the arguments relating to the right to silence and the privilege against self-incrimination would be quite similar to those relating to the presumption of innocence principle. Okay, so obviously in this last example that I mentioned, in jurisdictions where the courts say that a burden is never actually placed on a person to put forward any evidence whatsoever, the arguments are likely to be exactly the same, right? There's never a burden placed on an individual to break their silence. There's never a burden placed on an individual to make any potential incriminatory statements. So these principles are not really infringed upon in these particular jurisdictions. In the other jurisdictions, though, which do admit that a burden is reversed under their illicit enrichment laws, these courts are also likely to rely on jurisprudence that says that these specific principles, so the right to silence, they're a bit like the presumption of innocence principle. They're not actually absolute, and they can be infringed upon, for want of a better word, in certain special circumstances. For instance, in situations like I mentioned before, where the state is still required to prove essentially the fundamental facts of an accusation, or also where the information that a person is required to give is particularly within their own knowledge. Okay, so as I said, though, this particular question hasn't really been tested that much in the courts, so there's still a little bit of uncertainty surrounding the interaction between illicit enrichment and these particular principles. I'm conscious of the time and that I've only got a couple of minutes left, but I just want to mention as a final point that there's also been a lot of challenges made on illicit enrichment laws in some jurisdictions on the basis that they violate the principle against retroactive application. And the fact that these laws can sometimes apply to, say, asset acquisitions that happened before the laws were actually enacted in jurisdictions, okay? So just to explain that a bit further, specifically in some countries, if a person illicitly enriched themselves before a law came into place, say by using unjustifiable funds to purchase a house, and then say they still have possession of that house after an illicit enrichment law came into place, then in some countries, it's still possible for the state to find that person guilty of illicit enrichment, even if the initial acquisition happened before the law came into place. And there are lawyers around the world, in some countries, such as, say, Bolivia, that have claimed that this idea violates the principle against the retroactive application of laws. Okay. Courts, however, generally disagree. For instance, in Bolivia, the court said that this situation doesn't violate the principle of retroactive application. And they justified this on the basis that they felt that illicit enrichment should actually be considered as a continuous action that materializes constantly in each moment that passes after the initial acquisition itself happened, okay? So in other words, even if the initial acquisition or the initial enrichment took place before an illicit enrichment law came into place, the enrichment itself is still occurring continuously after that. So it's still occurring after the legislation was put into force, and therefore the enrichment can still be punished under the law, okay? In other jurisdictions, courts take a little bit of a different approach. They're not so flexible in their interpretation on this. And while they don't fully nullify illicit enrichment laws on the basis that they can potentially be applied retroactively, they do specifically say that their laws can only apply to asset acquisitions that occur after the law is put into place. And so to give examples, I think that's the case in Moldova and also Lithuania as well. I think I've run out of time. But I'd like to mention once again, shamelessly, that all the arguments that I've raised in the book that I mentioned at the start. I do go into these arguments in a lot more detail. So I'd suggest if you have time, the book is open access, free to get into on our website at the Basel Institute on Governance. And I'd highly encourage you to look at that if you're interested in the topic. Thank you very much.
I'm conscious now that we've run over time, so I'm going to hand over now to the next panel. I'd like to thank our four speakers for giving some fascinating overviews on unexplained wealth orders, tax, money laundering, real estate, and so on. And thank you, everybody. I'll now hand you over to the capable hands of other colleagues. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ryder, for that fantastic moderation, and thank you very much to our colleagues who've spoken really powerfully about different areas of unexplained wealth legislation. I think that this is the second panel today. My name is Chijioke Ofoji. I'm a senior lecturer in law at the Liverpool John Moores University. To move on to the lineup this morning, or this afternoon, sorry now, we have in the first instance Amina Al-Wahib from the University of Manchester. Amina will be talking about the era of corruption and unexplained wealth in the state of Kuwait. Thereafter, we have Andy Kons Matata from the Catholic University of East Africa. Andy Kons Matata, I understand, is going to be presenting jointly with Dr. E. Prema and Dr. Shinham Sundar from the VIT School of Law, and they'd be talking about unexplained wealth and African justice, or witch hunt. And last but not least is Dr. Stelios Andreadakis and Theo Nyrod, both of Brunel University, London. They'll be talking about unexplained wealth and tax havens doing business offshore. So without much ado, can I now welcome Amina Al-Wahib to take us through her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Can you please share my slides? If that's okay. Right. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to be part of this webinar. I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Amina Al-Wahib, and I am an assistant lecturer in Kuwait International Law School, starting a PhD in crimes of corruption and unexplained wealth in the state of Kuwait, focusing specifically on the recovery of stolen assets. Next slide, please. So today I'll be discussing the ongoing loophole of unexpected wealth. The key questions I'm going to highlight today are: how effective are the laws to deal with corruption and unexplained wealth in the state of Kuwait? And what legal instruments can be used to deal with the recovery of stolen assets in Kuwait? I'll obviously highlight this through case studies and proposed strategies and instruments. Next slide, please. Okay, I would first like to cover a brief history on Kuwait. The economy of Kuwait is based on its revenues that generates through natural resources, primarily oil. With that said, the Kuwaiti dinar is the highest currency in the world, and it has been argued that the significant dependence on oil is what creates this abuse of funds in the public sector. There has been an abuse and destruction of the economy as a result of misconduct from the outlooks of corruption, and this raises a concern that the rule of law may be undermined in the state of Kuwait, and the reputation of corruption affects the status of Kuwait in the international field. The reputation is supported by arguments that there's an imbalance of power in Kuwait, under which the royal family exercises control that is unnatural in a democracy and causes an unfair system under which public funds may be corrupted and abused from those in power. The Corruption Perception Index sets out that out of 180 ranked states, Kuwait is ranked the 78th due to the significant levels of corruption in the public sector. Next slide, please. I will now move on to the history of laws that combat corruption. Let's start off with the Protection of Public Funds Act, which basically introduced interim measures to ensure that state funds were protected and safe and not hidden away. The second one being Anti-Money Laundering and Combating Finance of Terrorism Act 2013, which basically deems that money laundering offenses as corruption crimes and provides for strict measures in terms of terrorism and finance. And finally, the Anti-Corruption Authority Act 2016, which highlights modern provisions to address the issue of corruption, including the requirement of public officials, politicians, and their spouses to make financial disclosures in order to identify any unexplained wealth. All these laws have been clearly seen ineffective. I'll explain why when we move further to the case law. So next slide, please. Obviously, corruption can be seen through bribe, illicit gain, money laundering, and many other things. So most common type of corruption in Kuwait is unexplained wealth recently. And we can see that through various cases, such as the military fund case, where they stole money from the military funds, inflated accounts of MPs, Kuwait oil tanker case, the KIA case, and the Al Raj'an case. And there are plenty of other cases, which unfortunately I have no time to explain. Next slide, please. I'd like to first start with the KIA case. So the Kuwait Investment Authority is a public body, and the purpose of this body was to manage government funds. But a few years after that incorporation, there were signs of corruption. In 1990, it has been seen that numerous public officials and trustees, including members of the royal family, have been involved in a theft of $6 billion. And the laws in place to deal with these crimes were ineffective. And these laws have been drafted in the 1960s and 70s. So the defendant's question could not be, sorry, back to the other slide, sorry. So the question that happened with the defendants was that they were tried for absentia. So that's when the civil action took place in the UK in 1999. And as a consequence of which the UK's judiciary, in its judgment, awarded damages of the value of $687 million due to the value of the funds that have been stolen. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's move on to the other scandal that was occurring, the Kuwait oil tanker company, where 4 public officials had been involved in an embezzlement of millions of dollars, which Kuwait was awarded $137 million in damages, which is basically much less than what they should have been compensated. Both the KIA and the KOTC cases illustrated a key flaw within the laws of Kuwait. For example, where offenses were committed outside the borders of Kuwait, the relevant authorities did not have the power to take action, while criminal action was out of the question. So civil powers were limited, meaning only actions such as civil claim in the UK courts could be brought, and it could be argued that this undermined the jurisdiction of Kuwait and its role as a sovereign state. Next slide, please. Finally, the third case, and it's the most recent case, the Fahad Al Raj'an case. He was a former head of Kuwait's National Pension Fund, and he is now living as a fugitive in London. And he has been accused for stealing $850 million from the Kuwait Public Institution for Social Security by securing secret commissions from the banks in return for investing their funds, which has been happening for 3 decades now. His case is still being held in the UK courts. And finally, cases like these have been ongoing and reoccurring for years now. And therefore, it's clear that the limited prosecution of matters such as unexplained wealth haven't been functioning. Next slide, please. There are 2 essential questions to be considered when determining whether someone has attempted an act of corruption and unexplained wealth. The first question to be asked is it reasonable? And if so, are the sources legitimate? If there's a failure to answer these questions, then administrative sources arise and unexplained wealth occurs. And next slide, please. So when there's a case dealing with stolen public funds, the burden of proof is under the criminal action beyond any doubt, high standard of proof and longer access and procedure. Whereas when it comes to the civil action, you can recover stolen assets without criminal action. So it's basically a lower standard of proof, for example, balance of probabilities. And it's an easier access to recover those stolen funds. Once stolen funds have been transferred abroad, they are extremely difficult to recover, as the process to recover those funds occurs in several steps. And these steps start by identifying and tracing those stolen assets, which may require cross-border cooperation between countries. And then it involves freezing those such assets. Therefore, civil action should be a strong instrument for recovery and would be recognized internationally if supported by final judgments. Such actions could be initiated in 1 or 2 jurisdictions, which I'm going to mention later on, and supported by actions that can be initiated in other jurisdictions. However, a question remains as to what can be done to support the recovery of stolen assets that are hidden or deposited in different companies, countries, or even banks. To address this, civil actions should enable the victim state to take other action against the accused persons in terms of stolen asset crime. Initiating civil action should enable victim states to request 2 other compensating requests, namely compensation of damages suffered by the victims as a consequence of the accused behavior of installing these assets. The victim state should also request compensation for the loss of opportunities following the investment of those stolen assets, which should consider the length of time that it has taken the victim state to recover its stolen assets. Therefore, in light of the civil action is a strong legal action that enables victim states to recover their stolen assets, as well as associate damages and interests. Next slide, please. There's a limited prosecution for matters such as corruption and the criminal regime that had been adopted by Kuwait has largely failed to address those issues. And therefore, there's a need for an effective civil regime to deal with those such issues. Kuwait's legal system does not have provisions for civil forfeiture and unexplained wealth orders, just like the UK, under Section 1 of Criminal Finances Act 2017. Its mechanism under which proceeds of crime can be confiscated through civil powers instead of criminal ones. And it requires a person to state the nature and extent of their interest in property and where it cannot be explained. The property is confiscated. It has been argued that this provides an effective means to address the issue of corruption, and it is necessary to consider whether these 2 mechanisms provide for an effective addition to Kuwait's arsenal to deal with corruption. Next slide, please. So the STAR initiative, the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, has been implemented by civil forfeiture and unexplained wealth orders, which are absent from Kuwait's legal framework. And this initiative has led to the recovery of over $500 million in the KIO case that I mentioned earlier. And it is clear that a critical analysis of this initiative and relevant implementation provisions in Kuwait is necessary. Next slide, please. In addition, civil actions should enable victim states to initiate actions known as other jurisdictions, such as the Mareva injunction and the Norwich Pharmacal injunctions, while the first should enable the victim state to freeze his assets worldwide, and the second should enable the victim state to gain legal access in order to discover all accused assets in banks and financial institutions. Next slide, please. Okay, so to conclude, the proposed instruments and strategies through using civil action methods in recovering stolen funds are essential and needed due to the easier and faster process to freeze and recover those stolen funds that have been moved abroad. and as it enables the victim state, Kuwait in our case, to gain legal access and visibility to their stolen funds and perhaps be compensated for them. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amina, for that fantastic presentation. I'm sure that there'll be a lot, to come back on during the Q&A. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So can we maybe go on a 5 minutes comfort break and then come back? So grab your coffee, grab your tea, and so on and so forth.